Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, the second in the Edge of Risk series sponsored by Stanford Hospital and Clinic's Risk Consulting. My name is Orquiza, and I'm a Director of Risk Management at Stanford University Medical Center. Today's topic is the active shooter, practical considerations for the new threat in healthcare. Let's start with a few comments about today's webinar. Our discussion today will be interactive in two ways. First, we will conduct a series of polls in which we will invite you to give your response. When prompted, please refer to the lower right panel of your screen where you will see the polling question and answer options. Once the polls close, we'll share the results with you, which will give everyone some valuable insight. Second, at any time during the presentations, we invite you to submit any questions you might have via the Q&A feature on the right panel of your screen. We'll be collecting all of your questions and addressing them at the end of our session today. You should have received a link to download our webinar toolkit, which includes the active shooter white paper or active shooter checklist and policy framework guidance. Please don't forget to download these documents for future reference. If you did not receive a link or are having any trouble with the download, please notify us via email at riskmanagement@stanfordmed.org. Lastly, please take a brief moment to review our disclaimer, which is located on screen now. We want you to understand that the content of this webinar shouldn't be taken as legal advice and is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed do not necessarily represent any official position of Stanford University or affiliates, Stanford University Medical Center, its faculty, staff, or employees, or the City of Palo Alto. Today's topic, the active shooter, presents challenges and dilemmas for healthcare organizations and their staff. Many of you may have wondered, or perhaps have never considered, what would you do if someone came into your organization with a gun and started shooting everyone in sight? Would your organization be prepared? While these events are rare, recent trends indicate active shooters pose a risk to healthcare organizations, which leads us into our discussion today. Although these events are unpredictable, healthcare organizations must understand that they are, in fact, preparable. How would you prepare your facility for such an event? How would you respond? How would you recover? Today, we are going to explore the issues and considerations that are relevant to healthcare organizations as they prepare policies and procedures for addressing an active shooter event. You will hear perspectives from professionals in mental health, law enforcement, and emergency management. Today, we have three esteemed experts joining our discussion who I would like to introduce. First, Dr. Justin Birnbaum is the Medical Director of the Behavioral Medicine and Medical Psychiatry Unit at Stanford University Medical Center. He also serves as Chief of Psychiatric Inpatient Services at Stanford, Associate Clinical Professor at the Stanford University School of Medicine, and a consultant to the California Department of Corrections for over 10 years. Dr. Birnbaum has joined us today and brings his expertise in the complexities of mental illness and violence, including mental health considerations for healthcare organizations during and after an active shooter event. Welcome, Justin.
Thank you, Dana.
We are also fortunate to be joined by Executive Management Professional and Police Officer Ken Dueker. Officer Dueker is the Coordinator of Homeland Security and Public Outreach with the Palo Alto Police Department and brings with him a wealth of experience in the development of programs and policies for the effective management of city and departmental Homeland Security risks. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Dana.
Our third speaker is Brandon Bond. Brandon is the Director of the Office of Emergency Management at Stanford Hospital and Clinics. Brandon is a member of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Bay Area Disaster Medical Assistance Team and has extensive experience in disaster preparedness. We are very fortunate to have Brandon with us to share his expertise. Welcome, Brandon.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Dana.
Now that our panelists have been introduced, we would like to know a little more about our audience today. So let's start with our first polling question. Using the options at the lower right panel of your screen, please pick the response that best describes your background. Are you a healthcare risk management professional, an attorney, a physician, administrator, or other? If you are having trouble seeing the poll question in the polling panel, You can also see the question on the slide. And it looks like many of you are responding. Don't forget, if you have any questions anytime during the presentation, please submit them via the Q&A feature on the right panel of your screen. We'll collect all questions and address them at the end of our session. Okay, so it looks like we have a majority of people who fall under the category of other. Okay, well, we do have a diverse range of attendees, but again, the majority falls under other. The diversity is good because this difficult topic touches everyone, and everyone should have a clear understanding of the nuances. As you may be well aware, security and disaster preparedness is everyone's responsibility. I'd like to begin by taking a look at today's learning objectives to get a clear picture of the ground we're going to cover over the next hour. First, we are going to define the term active shooter and discuss this term's significance to law enforcement's response. Next, with Dr. Birnbaum, we will consider the correlation between mental illness and violent behavior and whether there is an identifiable profile for the active shooter. We will then move on to discussing the 3 phases of emergency management from the law enforcement perspective with Officer Dueker, who will address steps your organizations can take to prepare, respond, and recover from an active shooter event. We will briefly turn back to Dr. Birnbaum to discuss some of the mental health considerations for staff during and after an active shooter event. And lastly, Brandon Bond will review options for developing an effective emergency response strategy with some practical tools you can take with you into your organization. So let's get started. At the outset, let's consider the term active shooter. As demonstrated by the infamous Columbine tragedy, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security defines the term to mean an individual actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a confined and populated area. In most cases, active shooters use firearms, and there is no pattern or method to their selection of victims. As distinct from shootings during a robbery or domestic violence, the active shooter's goal is to kill as many people as possible until they commit suicide or are injured or killed by police. Most events are over within 10 to 15 minutes. Active shooter events are unpredictable and evolve very quickly, and healthcare organizations need to be prepared to respond if and when they do occur. We should keep in mind that active shooter events are not a new phenomenon, and there have been numerous high-profile public shootings over the years. Some may remember the 1966 Texas shooting, when an ex-Marine and marksman climbed to the top of a clock tower at the University of Texas and methodically fired at victims below, killing 13 and wounding 31. In the aftermath, the SWAT team was formed. Another high-profile shooting occurred at a hospital in 1994, when an ex-Air Force serviceman entered Fairchild Air Force Base Hospital in Spokane, Washington, with an AK-47. Dean Melberg targeted 2 psychologists who recommended his discharge and then continued to move throughout the hospital's facility, killing 4 and wounding 23. And of course, we are all familiar with the shootings at Virginia Tech, Columbine, and Tucson, Arizona. You may be asking, why are these gunmen called active shooters? Aren't all shootings active? While that may be true, the term active shooter is crucial to law enforcement's response, which is distinct and dependent upon the facts reported. As you can see from this table, police will immediately neutralize an active shooter, but will attempt to apprehend or talk down a perpetrator when a gun is brandished or fired at only one victim. To be clear, in the case of the active shooter, where the perpetrator continues to shoot, law enforcement's objective is to swiftly and decisively neutralize the perpetrator. While it may in the moment be difficult for staff to distinguish between the active shooter and other gunmen, it is helpful to understand the distinction so that when 911 is called, law enforcement responds appropriately. It is clear that an active shooter event affects everyone. Although unpredictable and dynamic, they are in fact preparable. Now that we have defined the term active shooter and discussed the term's significance to law enforcement, let's open up our polls again. A significant part of disaster preparedness is having an understanding of the hazard itself. In relation to the active shooter, then, it's natural to ask whether violent individuals share a common profile. We want your opinion. What do you think is the top risk factor in the active shooter profile? Using the options at the lower right panel of your screen, please select your answer. Is it A, mental illness, B, age, C, gender, D, history of violence, or E, substance abuse? If you are having trouble seeing the poll question in the polling panel, you can also see the questions on the slide. Media coverage of active shooters often projects a stereotype or a profile. It seems that active shooters, notably the gunman in Virginia Tech, Arizona, and most recently at a school in Rio de Janeiro and a shopping mall in the Netherlands, are males in their 20s with some sort of mental illness. And it looks like the polls are closed, and a majority have selected mental illness. And second to that is a history of violence. Well, that's interesting. We'll hear from Dr. Birnbaum, who will address this question. Dr. Birnbaum will discuss the mental health perspectives on this issue. Specifically, he will address the risk factors associated with violent behavior, the association between violent behavior and mental illness, and the active shooter profile. Dr. Birnbaum?
Thank you, Dana, and good morning, everyone. After the shootings at Columbine, Virginia Tech, Arizona, and most recently Rio de Janeiro in the Netherlands, it seems natural to question the backgrounds, motivations, and the mental stability, or lack thereof, of the perpetrators. Were these extreme and seemingly senseless actions all carried out by deranged or disturbed individuals? Is there any way to predict or even prevent these rare and seemingly random events? To that end, awareness of the risk factors for violence is an important initial point of reference, because individuals involved in violent actions may share risk factors for these behaviors. Violence may be generally defined as behavior involving physical force intended to hurt, damage, or kill someone or something, and the greatest risk factor for violence is a history of past violence in the immediate past, recent past, or distant past. This is consistent with the axiom, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. Additional factors associated with an increased risk for participation in violent behavior include gender, where males have a greater propensity than females, age, with late adolescents and young adults at higher risk, a history of substance use, a history of childhood abuse, and marital status. Studies show that those who have never been married are at greater risk for violent behavior. There is also an evolving consensus concerning the relationship between serious mental illness and violence, with a variety of recent studies indicating an elevated risk for violence amongst individuals with mental health disorders. It is, however, worth emphasizing that the proportion of violence attributable to these individuals is relatively small. Although there are recognized risk factors for violence, we do not yet have a clear understanding of the risk factors particular to active shooters. A study conducted by the U.S. Secret Service and the U.S. Department of Education in 2002 found that there is no distinct or useful profile for an active shooter. Nonetheless, there may be red flags that could indicate a potential for this type of violence, which include drug and alcohol abuse, suicidality, statements made about firearms, other weapons, and violent crimes, paranoia, a pattern of inappropriate emotional responses, hostility, dysphoria and social withdrawal, a perception of injustice, and blame. Although the Secret Service study found no distinct profile for the active shooter, commonalities observed included gender, most were male, and well over 90% of the shooters had experienced a recent failure or loss that they perceived as serious. Perhaps the most distinctive feature was that the shootings were rarely the result of impulsive behavior. 93% were in fact planned. In attempts to conceptualize and understand active shooter events, it is worth taking into consideration possible motivating factors. Clearly, as diverse as the individuals involved in these events are, it is quite likely that the motivations are equally diverse. One potential motivation relevant to the healthcare arena is an act of vengeance driven by anger and/or frustration. These acts are completed by individuals who feel they have been wronged, disrespected, or ignored by institutions or individuals. The violent acts are often completed without regard to whether the individuals harmed are directly responsible for the perceived or actual harm. An example might be the Columbine tragedy, which by all appearances can at least in part be interpreted as an act of vengeance. An additional motivation also seen at Columbine was the desire for fame or acknowledgement. The notoriety associated with active shooter events is immense. Media attention is immediate and frequently reported nationwide, if not internationally. Suicidality or death wish may also be a contributing motivator. Frequently, rather than be apprehended by law enforcement, active shooters will turn their weapons upon themselves. In addition to the intent for widespread injury, the shooter is assumed to have an expectation they will not survive. Post-event investigation indicates the intent or expectation to die during the Virginia Tech and recent Tucson, Arizona shootings. Both Hui-Cho, who killed 32 students in Virginia in 2007, and Jared Loughner, who shot Representative Gabrielle Giffords and others in Arizona in 2011, appear to have been driven, at least in part, by a death wish. Moreover, motivations may be driven by symptoms associated with mental illness. Fears, anxieties, compulsions, driven perhaps in part by unfounded beliefs, may result in violent actions. Attempts to define a single motivation for the active shooter are not likely to be successful. It is more likely that in any given event, multiple motivations are operating, and since the shooter frequently does not survive, we are most often left to speculate as to their motivations in the aftermath. Let's return to the question of mental illness. A recurring assumption related to active shooter events relates to the apparent connection between violent behavior and individuals with mental illness. So, is there a link? Although the proportion of violence accounted for by individuals with mental illness is relatively small, there are a variety of studies that have shown an elevated risk of violence amongst this population. The well-known National Institute of Mental Health's Epidemiologic Catchment Area study, as well as the National Comorbidity Study, both revealed an increased rate of violence amongst individuals with major psychotic or mood disorders. And additional studies have concluded that there is a greater risk of homicide or other set of violent acts amongst individuals with psychotic illnesses. In terms of mental health-related risk factors for violence, after a past history of violence, substance abuse disorder is the next highest risk factor. This is followed by psychopathic or antisocial personality disorder, and then psychotic disorders, such as schizophrenia. We must be very careful not to assume that any association implies a direct cause and effect. This includes as it relates to the active shooter. In addition to the possible influence of psychotic symptoms or substance abuse, the downward socioeconomic drift of individuals with major psychiatric illness and the environments in which many individuals with major psychiatric illness find themselves, including housing situations, certain neighborhoods, proximity to others with difficult life circumstances, isolation and lack of social supports, should not be ignored as likely contributors to the risk of violence. The lack of mental health resources, which continues to diminish, also affects the risk of violence. Those who may benefit from treatment too often are unable to access appropriate treatment. Clearly, the relationship between mental disorders and violence is complex. To illustrate the complex nature of mental illness and the active shooter, let's consider the Virginia Tech gunman, Hui-Cho. We already mentioned that a past history of violence is a good predictor for future violence. Yet, in this case, Cho had no prior acts of violence. although with the benefit of hindsight, there were various potential predictors. He seemed to exhibit behavior not common amongst his peers. He infrequently made eye contact with his roommates, spoke on rare occasion, had a generally flat affect, and frequently demonstrated antisocial behavior. Perhaps the most telling sign were his English assignments, which were reportedly so violent that a professor referred him for professional counseling. He was eventually taken to a mental health facility after an acquaintance believed him to be suicidal. He was evaluated and deemed only a danger to himself and not to others. What can we conclude? Can we effectively profile the active shooter? Unfortunately, experience indicates the answer is no. But there are identifiable risk factors associated with individuals who exhibit violent behavior, which active shooters may share, and of which healthcare professionals should be aware. Evidence of mental illness alone is grossly insufficient for determining or predicting whether someone will become an active shooter. There may be predictive factors that increase the risk of violence. However, each shooter is different with varying motivations and life circumstances. Rather than attempting to predict, perhaps it is more beneficial for healthcare organizations and their staff to appreciate the complexity of the active shooter and focus their efforts on preparation, response, and recovery.
Thank you, Justin. It's interesting to hear that there is no active shooter profile, which debunks the media portrayal or myth. You've also explained the shooter's complex nature, that there is no single factor or motivation that could possibly explain these acts of violence or even predict them. I imagine that this is not only complex for mental health professionals, but for law enforcement as well. At this time, we're going to open up the polls again to ask, how quickly do you think police will take to arrive at your facility once 911 is notified of an active shooter? And many of you are responding. It's really important to know what to expect from law enforcement, particularly how fast they will arrive. You may recall that the SWAT team took approximately 45 minutes to assemble and enter Columbine. Post-Columbine, law enforcement learned some important lessons and adjusted their tactics accordingly, which included improving response time and strategy. And it looks like the polls are now closed, and a majority of you have selected 10 minutes. Now let's turn to Officer Dueker, who will provide the answer to that poll question and will provide law enforcement perspectives and considerations for the 3 phases of emergency management in relation to the active shooter. Prepare, respond, and recover.
Well, good morning, Dana, and good morning, all. Today's topic justifiably causes anxiety, if not outright consternation, for hospitals and for law enforcement alike. I would like to offer some key points from the law enforcement perspective that can be shared with your leadership and respective departments as you make plans to prepare for, respond to, and recover from a potential active shooter emergency. Ultimately, your leadership will determine what works best for your organization. Let's begin with the preparation phase. When preparing emergency plans for an active shooter scenario, it is crucial for hospitals to meet with local law enforcement, such as the county sheriff and the city and state police, as they are the first responders to an active shooter event. Building an effective relationship with local law enforcement over a series of meetings and hospital tours is beneficial for both parties. First, hospitals will develop a clear understanding of what to expect from law enforcement's response. Second, law enforcement will be in an advantageous position, having unique knowledge about the organization and its layout, which would likely prove a significant tactical advantage in an active shooter situation, affording faster access and response. First, let's talk about hospital expectations. It's in your hospital's best interest to avoid surprises and know exactly what to expect from law enforcement's first responders, particularly who will arrive, how many, and how quickly. Contrary to Hollywood depictions and popular belief, patrol officers, rather than the SWAT team, are tasked with the immediate response to an active shooter event. In many jurisdictions, the reality is that a relatively small number of patrol officers will constitute the initial entry team, whose objective is to locate the perpetrator or perpetrators and neutralize the threat. The initial entry team is not likely to constitute more than 4 to 5 officers. These officers are likely to arrive, to answer the question, within 10 to 15 minutes from the time of dispatch. If your facility is compromised, time is of the essence, and law enforcement needs every advantage you can give them. Remember that most police officers have only a passing familiarity with hospitals in their area and rarely go beyond the emergency department. Consider what would happen if your active shooter was an employee and knew more about the facility's layout than law enforcement. Let's consider a few things you can do to give local law enforcement that advantage. First, develop a relationship with your local officers. Take your first responders on a tour of your facility and familiarize them with the layout, key entrance and exit points, and storage areas where hazardous materials such as radiologics and chemicals are located. Secondly, locate your facility's nooks and crannies, including hidden tunnels and closets, which may prove advantageous in a crisis event. Third, point out security enhancements, such as the location of video cameras and the capabilities to stream video over the internet or remotely access the video system. Fourth, prepare a crisis box to deliver to law enforcement upon arrival that contains maps, keys, and access cards, everything that will enable them quicker access to locate the perpetrator. If law enforcement and the hospital know what to expect from each other, the potential for harm may be greatly reduced. In addition, consider having law enforcement participate in annual hazard vulnerability analysis to help identify your hazards and risks applicable to an active shooter. For those unfamiliar with the term, a hazard vulnerability analysis, or HVA for short, is a common annual process which many hospitals use for evaluating potential risks to the organization. Key managers will meet and identify various hazards, assess the organization's vulnerability and the likelihood of such an event, and create preparedness plans accordingly. The benefit of inviting law enforcement to these meetings will add value to your organization's HVA and will also strengthen your relationship with your officers. Law enforcement may also assist with completing your ACAMS assessment management questionnaire. ACAMS is the Automated Critical Asset Management System established by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security after September 11th. It electronically stores critical infrastructure information for local, federal, and state law enforcement to access during crisis events. Now let's move on to how to respond to an active shooter emergency, which is the second phase of emergency management. What do you do when shots are fired? Staff training and education are paramount to an effective active shooter preparation and response. Remember that patients and visitors will likely follow your staff's lead in such a situation. At all times, law enforcement emphasizes the importance of calling 911 first. As active shooter events often end within 10 to 15 minutes, immediate communication of the event is essential to mitigate the loss of life. Security is already in the hospital or on campus, but the police are not, and will sometimes take several minutes to get there. When dialing 911, try to avoid using a cell phone. Bandwidth may be impacted by massive use. Depending on the cell network coverage, police may not be able to pinpoint exactly where you are. Staff should also be trained to provide a description of the shooter, number of shooters, weapons used, the type of weapon, number of potential victims, and the exact location of the shooter, such as first floor, B wing. Avoid using terms such as the NICU or L&D when describing the location. These terms are not generally helpful to law enforcement and may waste valuable time. Now let's turn to actions recommended by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. DHS recommends that individuals evacuate, hide out, and in some cases, take action against the shooter when shots are fired. These actions can be simplified to get out, hide out, take out. I'd like to emphasize caution and clarify that healthcare is in a unique and difficult circumstance. Healthcare organizations must decide what processes are best for their patients, staff, and organization. First, DHS recommends get out and evacuate if there is an accessible escape path. Hospitals must consider education and training on how staff can safely evacuate patients, visitors, and themselves. DHS also recommends locating your facility's nearest exits, leaving all belongings behind, keeping hands visible and raised, following instructions of any police officers, and not attempting to move any wounded people. Obviously, in the healthcare setting, this could be fraught with difficulty. You can't simply evacuate patients on ventilators and life support equipment. What if you're in the middle of operating? These are considerations which your organization needs to carefully consider when developing guidelines for hospital employees. DHS's second recommendation is hideout. If evacuation is not possible, find a place to hide where the active shooter is less likely to find you and your patient. Silence your cell phone and pager and turn off any sources of noise. Your hiding place should provide protection if shots are fired, not trap or restrict your options for movement, and should prevent an active shooter from entering. DHS also recommends locking and blocking doors with heavy furniture, keeping calm, and patiently waiting for law enforcement to give the all-clear message. Takeout refers to taking action against the active shooter by, for example, throwing objects or improvising weapons to disrupt or incapacitate the shooter. DHS recommends takeout only as a last resort when your life is in imminent danger. When developing policy and procedure for active shooters, organizations will need to carefully consider this option in their response plans. A quick word on security. They are often unarmed and wear uniforms similar in appearance to law enforcement. Education and training will assist staff with clarifying security's role, that they are not law enforcement and are in no better position to address the shooter than other staff. Security plays a larger role outside the danger zone. They can perform numerous tasks such as evacuation, traffic control, and assisting at the command post. Moreover, they can also assist law enforcement by serving as their eyes and ears by observing suspects from a safe distance and videotaping the events. Let's discuss what your organization can expect when law enforcement arrives. Initially, when the police arrive, staff should not expect rescue by the initial entry team, whose goal is to neutralize the threat. In their pursuit of the active shooter, the initial entry team will step over and walk past victims, and staff need to be trained to let them do their job. Staff should not approach the initial entry team members and should keep their hands high above their heads at all times. During the response phase, the most important step is to establish liaison. Immediately upon law enforcement's arrival, the administrator on call or security officer will meet with first responders outside of the hospital, most likely in a parking lot as opposed to a conference room or the hospital command center. The liaison is responsible for communicating all hospital incident command information directly to police incident command. This enables effective and integrated crisis management, which will not likely be compromised by the active shooter. There are some additional variables to consider that will affect police response and evacuation. These include the possibility of multiple shooters, multiple crime scenes, explosives, getaway drivers, counter surveillance, and an active shooter among injured staff. The response phase may be as quick as a few minutes or as long as several hours, depending on how active or static the situation is. If active, the initial entry team will move directly toward the sound of gunfire or screaming to neutralize the suspect. If static, the entry team will complete a slow, methodical search and will need to work with staff, particularly security personnel. After additional law enforcement arrives and sends the all-clear signal or message, staff that have been sheltered in place or barricaded themselves can evacuate. The rescue team, which includes the fire department and EMS, will remove and treat victims only after an all-clear message is sent. And how does the response phase end? There are generally three possible outcomes. First, the suspect commits suicide. As we previously heard, active shooters do not generally seek to escape. Second, the suspect is shot and killed or injured by law enforcement. Or third, arrested. In the hours following the incident, various law enforcement agencies will need access to the facility. For example, if your organization had a shooting in the cafeteria, which is a limited and defined area, the cafeteria will be cordoned off as a crime scene for hours or days. On the other hand, if the shooter had gone through numerous departments, shooting many victims, and used explosives in 2 different wings of the hospital itself may be shut down, closed off, and not operational for days or longer as one big crime scene. Again, depending on the crime, Other federal and state agencies may need to conduct their own investigations, further complicating and slowing down the recovery process. Such an event would be a significant challenge to the continuity of operations in the clinical setting, and healthcare organizations will need to balance the needs of patients and staff with the need to cooperate with various agencies in assisting in the investigation and cleanup. In closing, active shooter events are complex and volatile. When developing an effective preparation, response, and recovery plan, building a strong relationship with law enforcement is essential. While the DHS has provided guidelines on how organizations should respond, healthcare organizations need to carefully develop guidelines appropriate for the complexities of their environment.
Thank you, Ken, for providing some excellent takeaways for our audience today, such as establishing liaisons so that both the hospital and police are working in unison, DHS's recommended actions when gunshots are heard, and how recovery is dependent on the crime. This leads us into our next discussion on recovery. Recovery is multifaceted. It involves business continuity, structural integrity, community resources, and, of course, mental health. I'd like to ask Dr. Birnbaum back to comment on this issue. Dr. Birnbaum, what are the kinds of considerations healthcare organizations can look at from a staff and mental health perspective?
Thank you, Dana. Yes, there are a number of issues to consider here. Officer Dueker has outlined a number of key recommendations, and as he noted, healthcare providers are in a unique and difficult circumstance. There is tremendous tension between healthcare missions and values versus self-protection. In the healthcare setting, an important mission is to maintain the safety and security of patients, and significant dilemmas may arise when an active shooter rampage starts. What if patients are immobile? Should staff take the time to help the patients escape, or should staff take actions which may save their own lives? Staff may have to make some very difficult decisions, ethically and emotionally. It is likely that many individuals may experience second-guessing and guilt after an active shooting. Hospital leadership must provide guidelines as well as emotional support to assist staff in coping with the trauma of surviving an active shooter event. But realize that depending upon the situation, these policies may fall far short of providing clear guidelines for specific behaviors and actions during real-time dilemmas. In addition to decision-making dilemmas, we must also consider post-event consequences for victims and survivors. After sudden, incredibly frightening events resulting in death and injury to multiple people, those who have survived the event are likely to react or respond to the trauma in a variety of ways. Frequently, there is a sense of disbelief or denial amongst survivors. Emotional turmoil presenting as fear, anger, confusion, guilt, or grief is common. Intrusive re-experiencing or reliving of the event during the day or as nightmares, and heightened physiologic responses such as an exaggerated startle response are common. The development of post-traumatic stress disorder may also occur. Hospital administrators should consider resource allocation for grief and trauma counseling to assist staff. This is an important component to any emergency response plan.
Thank you very much, Justin. I think what this drives home is the need for organizations to not just consider the operational impacts of such an event, but to be sensitive and supportive of their employees and allocate proper resources to ensure the organization's greatest assets are properly cared for. Let's pause for a moment and ask our fourth question. Have you been trained in emergency management response? A, yes, or B, no. Looks like many of you are responding. Many organizations, especially in California, probably have emergency management response training for earthquakes. The active shooter is a distinct threat, and it'll be interesting to see whether this type of emergency response training will be increasing over the next few years. And it looks like the polls are now closed. And a majority say they have been trained in emergency management. For those of you who answered yes, it's wonderful to hear that emergency response training has been provided. Our next speaker, Birnbaum, will speak to emergency response, education, training, and exercise. Let's now turn to discussing the practical aspects of preparing an emergency response plan to effectively respond and recover from an active shooter event. Thank you again for joining us, Brandon.
Thank you, Dana. I'd like to focus on some of the more operational steps healthcare organizations can take before an active shooter event occurs. Since security is everybody's responsibility, I want to emphasize the importance of staff education, training, and exercise. This will constitute the core of this presentation. I will then turn to address the roles and responsibility for staff, security, and leadership during the response phases. A military strategist once stated, "No battle plan ever survives the first contact with enemy." And the same can be said for hospital planning to prepare, respond, and recover from an active shooter event. As both Dr. Birnbaum and Officer Dueker have stated, organizations can have well-written plans. However, they may not cover the complete spectrum of endless possibilities and variables. Nevertheless, hospitals can mitigate the potential loss, damages, and ensuing chaos through effective preparation that includes a continuous cycle of education, training, and exercise, which will assure the continuous improvement and mitigation potential of the overall emergency response plan. As a start, all staff, particularly clinical staff, will need to be educated on the risk of the active shooter and what to do to protect themselves and their patients in such an event. The first phase in emergency management is to prepare. Let's consider what your organization can do. Similar to the Patient Safety Initiative of color-coded wristbands, many hospitals have adopted color coding for emergencies. For the most part, color codes for fire, infant abduction, and medical emergency are standardized. A recent development has been designation of a code silver to warn of a combative person with a weapon. Guidelines for code silver are not yet standardized among organizations. The challenge with implementing Code Silver is ensuring it corresponds with law enforcement's response, understanding that brandished weapons are treated differently from gunshots fired or the active shooter. Because of this, many hospitals have either implemented or considered implementing a unique code to specifically address the active shooter event. One local hospital has adopted two types of Code Silver, a Code Silver and a Code Silver shelter in place. A Code Silver alerts staff to a combative person with a weapon. A Code Silver shelter in place is initiated for a weapon fired. The educational guidelines for a Code Silver shelter in place include a procedure for staff directly involved in patient care to hide and barricade. It also includes an evacuation procedure for staff not directly involved in patient care. After developing your active shooter policy and plan, leadership and staff need to be educated on their roles and responsibilities. Clinical staff are responsible for protecting their patients as well as themselves. Security will often function as the liaison between the hospital incident command and the police incident command. They are also responsible for lockdown procedures, assisting in evacuation, and communication. Leadership is tasked with command, control, and communication during the event. Hospital staff may have to reconsider overhead paging a code blue during an active shooter event, which could potentially send medical personnel into the kill zone or attract the active shooter to a specified location. Employees should be educated to meet at an assembly area where they report to their chain of command once they are evacuated. Accountability of evacuated employees poses a great challenge. Many people will flee the scene, but one can expect patients and visitors to look to staff members for leadership. One option healthcare organizations can consider is a mass notification tool, which will likely have better success with staff accountability if built in as a component of the emergency response program. In light of the Columbine incident, where bombs were planted by the perpetrators in places where people were likely to assemble for safety, organizations should exercise caution when designating evacuation assembly points. Designated assembly points may also create a target of opportunity for explosive devices planted by the perpetrator. It is important to recognize that under the stress of an active shooter, staff may not be able to recall specific steps or perform as educated. In a crisis, people respond with three basic human reactions. they focus, fold, or freeze. The goal of training and exercise is to get people to focus on responding to the crisis at hand, rather than have them fold or freeze. Training builds confidence, and confidence builds survival. This is essential to effective confrontation and management of an active shooter crisis. U.S. air pilot Captain Sullenberger is a prime example of someone trained to focus on managing emergencies. As you all may remember, he successfully landed a crippled jetliner in the Hudson River. It is this controlled train response that hospital organizations should strive to instill in their staff. In fact, studies have shown there is a difference between the reactions of individuals who have been trained to address stressful, life-threatening emergencies as compared to those who have not. For example, untrained staff often experience disbelief and denial in a crisis situation and may be paralyzed by a sense of helplessness. In contrast, trained staff will have some anxiety, but they'll know what to do. They'll complete the tasks they have rehearsed in exercises and commit to their actions. All staff should learn how to deploy a survival mindset, which is different from our automated physiological response of fight or flight. During fight or flight, panic and confusion are likely to ensue. Staff must learn and train on how to deploy and develop the survival mindset. The survival mindset has three main components. First, awareness. Second, preparation. And third, rehearsal. Awareness sounds like a basic concept, but in an active shooter situation, some may fall into disbelief or denial. As an exercise, think about 9/11. When you first heard that the two planes hit the World Trade Center, did you immediately believe it, fully appreciate it, or did you question it? Awareness requires you to immediately recognize and understand the situation, then adapt. Once your mind accepts rather than denies the sound of the gunshots, you will be able to respond quickly and effectively. The second component is preparation, which is mentally preparing yourself for what you need to do to survive. In developing an effective response, it is important to ask all the what-if questions. What if you can't make it to the nearest exit? What if you can't lock your door? What can you use to barricade the door? The last component of developing a survival mindset is rehearsal, which involves physical and mental practice of the plan. It provides the opportunity to test how quickly and how effectively you respond to the crisis. During rehearsal, staff can review all their what-if plans and adjust them accordingly to the situation as it evolves. Rehearsing saves time and can ultimately save lives. The Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program provides a standardized methodology for designing, developing, evaluating, and improving crisis plans, and is a resource healthcare organizations should be aware of. It is a national standard for assessing strengths and weaknesses of an organization's exercises. The first step is to conduct a tabletop exercise, where an emergency situation is simulated in a superficial manner with a stress-free environment. Key leadership and first responders meet to discuss roles and responsibilities and procedures. It is a brainstorming session where the group solves one issue at a time. The advantages of a tabletop exercise are, 1, it generally requires minimal resources like time, money, and personnel. 2, it provides opportunity for an effective review of plans, policies, and procedures. And 3, it is a great method for key personnel to familiarize themselves with emergency responsibilities and procedures. The disadvantages include a lack of realistic stressors because it is conducted as a meeting rather than a simulation. And there are no mechanisms to demonstrate system overload that occurs in a real crisis. After completing a tabletop exercise, a functional exercise can be performed that will simulate an active shooter situation. This is highly interactive where role players have the opportunity to practice their response to an emergency. These exercises are carefully planned and scripted to allow real-time responses and consequences. You may not have an actor playing the shooter, however, staff can start with components of the response such as sheltering in place, communication, and activating the hospital's incident command system. The advantages of functional exercises are that they are interactive. They provide realistic simulation with stressors, and most importantly, there are no safety risks. The disadvantages is that it requires a moderate amount of resources. The functional exercise is valuable for evaluating adequacy of policy and procedure, staff and system performance, communication, resource and personnel allocation, and effectiveness of emergency management. This type of exercise may be an option for those organizations who want to test their emergency response plan without the associated cost or safety risks of a full-scale exercise. From the functional exercise, hospitals can build up to a full-scale exercise, which is a simulation closest to the stress of the real emergency in a controlled setting. The goal is to create the stress of the human reaction so that staff have an opportunity to learn how they will respond when they hear gunshots. A full-scale exercise is a time-consuming and requires careful planning, leadership, support, personnel, expertise, and additional cost, but it is the most effective mechanism by which organizations can fully challenge and test their emergency response process and systems. Clearly, the advantages of a full-scale exercise includes realistic simulation with stressors. The most noteworthy disadvantage is the cost. The exercise is resource and labor-intensive for any sized organization. It requires a great deal of planning, generally at least 1 year in advance. It also has safety risks associated with improper planning and communication. A note of caution: if your organization decides to complete a full-scale exercise, thorough and careful planning, communication, and coordination is critical to avoid a catastrophe. One Nevada hospital learned this lesson the hard way when they initiated an unannounced active shooter drill that terrified ICU staff and left patients unattended for approximately 15 minutes. For this reason, communication from the top down to all levels of the organization, as well as with law enforcement and 911 dispatch, is critical. Imagine what could go wrong if staff, police, and the 911 dispatch were not aware of your full-scale active shooter exercise. The police would pursue your actor in an attempt to neutralize a perceived threat. Unannounced drills and poorly planned full-scale exercises can result in high stress, compromised patient care, and staff not wanting to participate in drills or the emergency management program. Before conducting a full-scale exercise, ensure you involve all the necessary parties and provide clear communication about the event to foster a good learning environment, as opposed to a catastrophic consequence. Upon the completion of exercises, the lessons learned should be documented in an after-action report, and improvements can be made to bridge the gap of noted deficiencies as a part of the cycle of improvement. What can your organization do to prepare for the recovery phase? During the recovery phase, organizations are focused on consequence management, which includes addressing life safety of those injured, media relations, assessing operational capability of your facility, and evaluating utility infrastructure. Depending on the nature and extent of the crime and damage, these elements can create a complicated recovery for your organizations. Hospitals will need to work with law enforcement in their ability to continue to provide patient care while maintaining the security of the crime scene for the criminal investigation. Smartphone technology and social media provide additional challenges in that information is released before formal statements. As a result, it is essential that media relations be notified immediately to provide the public with accurate and up-to-date information via multiple communication channels, including Twitter and Facebook. Discrepancies and inaccuracies can be detrimental, causing media frenzy, panic, embarrassment, and public outcry. Organizations must have a strong business continuity plan that enables maintenance of business operations during the recovery phase. Again, depending on the extent of the crime, hospitals may have to work with county EMS to transport patients to other facilities. Simultaneously, your emergency department may be surging to treat a high volume of victims. Consider that bullets may also compromise your hospital's infrastructure. For example, high-pressure gas lines may be damaged, requiring immediate attention from engineering and maintenance. In closing, I'd like to end with some additional things you might consider in preparation for an active shooter event. Memorandum of Understanding and or mutual aid agreements with other hospitals may assist your facility to cope with and to continue your operations. Expansion of on-site surge capacity and priority setting for limited resources may give your hospital the capacity to effectively treat the likely influx of patients and continue your service to existing patients. Dr. Birnbaum has already mentioned allocating resources for mental health and crisis counseling services. As you can see, organizational preparation and recovery can be complex and dynamic, but it can be done effectively to positively mitigate against the potential harm which an active shooter event could cause your organization, staff, visitors, and patients.
Brandon, thank you for sharing your expertise in emergency management. It's clear that the best preparation can be obtained through education, training, exercise, and the cycle of emergency management process improvement. In light of these highly publicized, random, and senseless shootings, we don't want these critical lessons and what to do and how to deploy a survival mindset to be learned for the first time during a real-time active shooter event. Well, I would like to thank our speakers for their valuable insight into the most horrific type of workplace violence, the active shooter. Although the likelihood of an active shooter event in a hospital is rare, the consequences and severity are extreme. The positive news is that while devastating and unpredictable, hospitals can prepare themselves for the active shooter by adapting their current workplace violence prevention programs and emergency response programs to address the ever-changing risks of violence in today's society. Plans aren't perfect, but concrete steps can be taken to develop and test your organization's emergency response plan, which will not only improve the ability of your staff to mentally and physically confront and effectively manage the active shooter, but may go a long way to mitigate the harm that could otherwise result. This concludes our discussion. Before we move to our question and answer session, here are a few reminders. Please don't forget to download and review your active shooter toolkit. Instructions for download are provided in your registration email, and if you're not able to access the toolkit, please contact riskmanagement@stanfordmed.org. Please save the date to participate in the next Edge of Risk series webinar. The topic is medical literacy and is sure to be enlightening. That webinar is scheduled for July 2011. So let's begin the question and answer session. I want to let you know that we have received several great questions, and if we cannot get to your question today, we will respond to you individually via email. Our first question looks like this is for Dr. Birnbaum. I understand that no one can completely predict when another person will become violent or bring a gun to a hospital. But for those who work in a healthcare setting, it would be good to at least have the top 3 potential factors that might tell us someone could become violent. Can you give us your top 3 predictors?
Yes, let me first emphasize, and I agree with the statement that we can't be expected to fully predict human behavior. That being said, it's worth being aware of risk factors, and the 3 that I would highlight are first, any history of violence, with more recent history of violence being of greater significance. Second, the presence of a substance use disorder. And the third factor that I would emphasize is any expression, and certainly repeated expression, of intent to harm others. This can come in verbal form or written form, including messages that perhaps could be sent via text or through the Internet.
Thank you, Dr. Birnbaum. And the question 2, I believe, is for Officer Dueker. And the question is, I've seen some training exercises where people are covered in blood and running around yelling and screaming. How realistic should a training exercise be?
Thanks, Dana. The short answer, as Brandon alluded to, is to make every training as realistic as possible within the limits of your time and resources. Obviously, we don't want to create real panic, and we really don't want to create psychiatric issues for people who participate in drills, but up to that limit, the more realistic you can make it, the better prepared you will be. Again, we're trying to build a trained and ready population within your clinical setting.
And one more question, Officer Dueker. You've been talking about situations where doctors and nurses may have to make a split-second decision about what to do and who to save. How does someone know what is the right decision to make?
Sure, and that's something that clinicians share in common with us in law enforcement, which is sometimes you don't have the time that you ideally would like to have to make life and death decisions. And as Dr. Birnbaum alluded to, a lot of these things have to do with the mental readiness of your own staff. There are not hard and fast rules. We can't sit here today and tell you what the correct answer is. These are all case by case. Again, the better prepared you are to make hard decisions, the less likely it is that you'll fold or give up, and we'd rather have you focus.
Thank you, Officer Dueker. And we have 2 more questions. Brandon, the first question is, I am concerned about retaliation from a disgruntled former employee. Does this count as an active shooter?
This doesn't count as an active shooter. This is a workplace violence situation that certainly if you have that concern, then you'd want to address it with your security department and follow your hospital's workplace violence policy.
And the last question, while many employees are provided training for emergency situations, what is the reasonable expectation that employees will remain present and willing to assist in an emergency situation?
That was somewhat answered by Officer Dueker in the previous question that he had, and we have to look towards the training and hope that our employees will do the best in the reasonably expectation. But we can't expect that everyone is going to absolutely stay. I mean, everybody's going to react differently to the situation. But I think we've also seen in many of these situations that employees tend to step up to do the best they can given the training and skills that they have. So people tend to try to do the best.
Thank you, Brandon. And we have our last question for Officer Dueker. What type of clear message after the situation has been secured should we expect, and from whom?
Okay, great. That's an excellent question, and it's kind of a 2-part answer. First, law enforcement is going to essentially take over your facility as we search for the bad guy. And I think the important thing, as I alluded to in my discussion earlier, is that it may or may not be a sole actor. In most cases it is, but in, for example, a terrorist-type situation that we've seen in other countries predominantly, there are more than one suspect. There may be bombs. There may even be chemicals. There may be other things to look at. So only law enforcement can give the clear message. However, how you receive that message, as Brandon alluded to, may be through a mass notification system, possibly overhead paging, or other means. So that's going to be something that your clinical setting needs to address about how you communicate that. If everybody has left your facility and your facility is now clear, you may be able, to a large extent, to resume operations, but that won't happen unless you have your people back.
Thank you very much for your responses. This concludes the Active Shooter webinar. If we didn't get to your question, we will respond via email. Thank you very much for attending and participating in the interactive polls. And for further questions, or if you would like to contact Stanford Risk Consulting, please email riskmanagement@stanfordmed.org. You may now disconnect.